Looking back at the older generations of consoles, I find that the 6th generation was a special era of gaming. Half of the franchises that are a staple of the modern gaming scene had made their start here, along with this being home to many cult classic titles that were allowed to experiment, while still having some money put behind them. But with that amount of funds backing a project, there still had to be some returns, and unfortunately, many games failed to meet the mark. Psychonauts was one of those titles, a creative platformer that was deemed a financial failure when it came out on the OG Xbox and PlayStation 2, but got a second wind a few years later when it was ported to Steam. Sometime last year I polled my community on what game they wanted me to review, and an overwhelming amount of them voted for Psychonauts. Sucks to be a fan of those other games, but I'll get to a couple of them, eventually. Odds are if you're watching this video, you're either a fan and you're looking for a different perspective on this game, or you haven't played Psychonauts and you're wondering if this old title is still worth your time. Well, let's find that out. But first, here's a detour.
My name
Starts with a D.
is Rasputin.
When it comes to the 6th gen platformer, it's rather odd to see that it originated from a team that worked on point-and-click games. Double Fine was founded by Tim Schafer, a former developer of LucasArts, who created his own studio after he finished work on Grim Fandango, with Psychonauts being the studio's first game. And after Psychonauts came out to critical success but financial failure, Double Fine went on to work on many more experimental games over the years before doubling down and making the long-awaited sequel to Psychonauts back in 2015. But that's a story for a different video. If you want to see that hypothetical video, there are buttons beneath this one and a comment section to talk about stuff. A little interaction and, I don't know, 50 likes or so can go a long way.
It's a recruiting office, kids, and I'm here to recruit you for the greatest job in the world, being a psychonaut.
The game takes place in a totally immoral and ethical government training facility, used to train young kids into becoming psychic soldiers, or as they're called in-game, Psychonauts. Our protagonist Raz breaks into this camp and shows plenty of promise, only to be reminded that he can't stay there without his parents' approval, so he'll have to leave in a few days. However, that's not going to stop Raz from using whatever time he does have to learn how to be a proper psychic, only for strange events to start affecting the other campers.
TV? Well,
Nothing too out of the ordinary here. I mean, just look at what's playing, I'd act like that too.
About George Socks, the revolutionary high-performance gaming socks made by gamers for gamers.
Looking at how this game is aged visually, I have to say that things are rough. I can't be too harsh. I mean, this game is more than 15 years old, but I can point out some of the issues. The good news is that the resolution can be cranked all the way up to 1080p, and from a casual glance, the game looks fine at this setting. Though when I look closer, things start to look bad. This rough look comes in two folds. On one side is the art style, with the bizarre shapes of the characters. I get the vibes of a late 90s, early 2000s Nickelodeon show from the aesthetic, which gives Psychonauts a lot of character in my eyes. Though I think some of the side characters are a bit of a mixed bag in terms of their designs. I don't know, I look at some of these characters and then I think something might have been lost between the concept art and translating that into a 3D model. The other part of the presentation is the quality of the character models, and the fact that I can tell based on the polygon count which is a primary, a secondary, and a tertiary character. I'm not complaining that Raz looks nicer than the random kid that you can ignore for the whole game, but the gap in quality is noticeable, and the higher resolution makes this difference even easier to spot. The campgrounds look pretty nice though. While the topography was a bit strange, I was able to get my bearings after a while. The main levels are where things get the most visually interesting, but I'll get more into that when I go into the minds of these characters. Moving on to the gameplay, it's important to note that a 3D platformer is built on its moveset, and Psychonauts delivers well in this regard. Before jumping into the first level, I was messing around with Raz's moveset, and it generally felt good to jump around in the hub area. You start off with some basic abilities like a jump and a double jump, which have a satisfying jump height. You get a basic 1-2-3 punch combo for fighting off enemies, and that's made simple enough thanks to the enemies not having that much health. Then there's the pole swinging, which threw me off the first time through. I assume you switch what direction you faced by pushing the analog stick in that direction, but actually there's just a dedicated button to flip the direction. That's a little weird, but I can adjust to that. As a whole, it's a pretty basic moveset that's lifted up by some good game feel. However, things get more complex with the psychic abilities you get throughout the game. Early on, you get the Psy Blast and Levitation, which will be the two moves that'll get the most use throughout the game. Psy Blast is a simple projectile attack that lets you hit enemies from a distance, with a helpful lock-on to make aiming easier. Levitation is a pretty fun move that gives you the ability to balance yourself on a rolling ball that can be used to bounce up really high. In fact, I think it's a little too good for this game. I found that some of the platforming challenges tend to break with this ability, since you get some extremely good airtime with this. If you need to know how broken this ability is, there's a bit later in the game where you need to get over this gate, but the levitation ball can bounce so high that you can actually reach above the gate itself. It's crazy. Anyhow, you get a secondary ability alongside with your levitation power to slow down your descent with the left trigger button. It's actually a little weird how the levitation ball and the descent are tied to two different buttons when they're functionally the same move, but this is far from a big issue. The 6 other abilities collected throughout the game are pretty interesting, but they vary in quality. Pyrokinesis, Telekinesis, and Invisibility are obtained through leveling up, and these abilities get some good use in the second half of the game. The last 3 abilities, Shield, Clairvoyance, and Confusion, are primarily used in the level that you get them in. The wildest one is Confusion, with you lobbing a smoke grenade at the enemy. I like the visual of the grenade being the dot underneath the question mark. That's clever. I definitely got a soft spot for Clairvoyance though, since it can be used on every NPC in the game, and each of them have a unique image for how they perceive Raz. I know it's just a PNG, but I like the extra bit of character that it gives off.
It is a good day.
I'm watering.
Me too. Perhaps we can swap watering tips.
When it comes to Psychonauts, the levels, dubbed the mental worlds, are the bread and butter of this game. Not just because of the content, but for the creativity on display. Every level in this game is based on the mind of a major character that you meet along the way. The first 3 levels are based on the camp counselors and are fairly simple areas where most of the tutorials for this game are located. The levels following after this are where things get crazy. All of these levels are filled with collectibles, like figments, emotional baggage, mental cobwebs, and memory vaults. Figments are functionally like the coins in a Mario game. They're darted all over the place and function as a visual indicator of where to go. A really nice detail I like is that each figment has a unique look for their contextual placement in the game world. Emotional baggage is such a fun concept for a collectible. It's a literal bag that's laying around in the level that you have to find a matching tag to calm them down and collect. You can even hear them crying in the environment, which is a nice touch. Mental cobwebs need to be extracted with a tool that you can buy later in the game. The only noteworthy thing is that they start off as a background decoration, but then grow into an obstacle later in the game. The memory vaults are where things get interesting. These contain the memories hidden deep within the subconscious of each of the characters, which gives more insight into their lives before bumping into Raz. All of these collectibles are fun to collect, except for the figments. Those are a pain in the ass to find. The problem boils down to being able to see the damn things because their opacity is set so low that they blend into the environment. On some levels, they're so translucent that I couldn't even see the item before picking it up despite it being right next to my character. Insult to injury is that a couple of them move for some asinine reason, and a number of them are on rail grinding segments, which is really annoying. I wouldn't really care too much about this, but figments are tied to leveling up your character. And while thankfully the threshold for the basic upgrades are really forgiving, it doesn't make up for how frustrating it is just to pick these items up. Quick heads up, I'm going through every level in this game and giving a basic overview. If you want my non-spoilery thoughts on the levels, the first third or so is pretty basic, but the most memorable parts of this game are in the back half. Feel free to skip to this time if you want to go in fresh, and with that said, Oleander's Basic Branding is a simple tutorial that works well as an introduction to the game. Weird pole swinging notwithstanding. Despite looking like a war zone, the level, much like Oleander himself, is a lot more bark than bite. Hell, there are even a few shortcuts hidden around, so it's a very cozy introduction. That target hitting minigame was pretty fun though. Sasha's shooting gallery is amazing from a visual standpoint. Since Sasha himself is so meticulous, he even went as far as to organize everything in his mind into a compact box. Then when things start to unravel, the platforms that are formed make great use of visual storytelling to tell us about Sasha's life, from his childhood to the years before becoming a Psychonaut. Hell, the boss fight is pretty good for being a simple, bulky target to shoot at. Mila's dance party is fine. It feels the least like a tutorial, which is nice, with this level being more about using the levitation ball to get from the lower parts of the level to the top. Though the race located partway through is a complete garbage fire in execution. The Figment problem that I mentioned earlier is made worse with the colorful background, and Raz moves way too fast. Aside from that, the level is pretty fun, and the hidden bit of nightmare fuel is a cool thing to find off the beaten path. The training wheels come off when you get into Lungfishopolis. Hell, just to get into this place, you need to fight off the aforementioned fish in a pretty solid boss fight. The stage itself is a pure style over substance, but the gimmick here is so much fun. Since you're playing from the perspective of a lungfish, you come off like a Godzilla-sized monster, complete with the ability to climb buildings, demolish the city, and,
Where is the police? It was
stomp on the fish. The hell, why am I allowed to do that? There's not much in terms of platforming here, but the setting alone makes this a memorable part of the game. Speaking about memorable parts, the Milkman Conspiracy is the level that everyone brings up when discussing this game, and yeah, it's really good. It's far from perfect, with the point-and-click DNA of this level grinding against the natural flow, but the creativity and the bizarre tone are something to marvel at. I don't want to say too much because this level needs to be experienced, but I will say that the NPCs are probably my favorite in the game. They are just hilarious.
I am a grieving widow.
I am your sister in grief.
I'm watering.
Me too. Perhaps we can swap watering tips.
Glorious Theater is a bit of a mixed bag with its execution, but the story told here is good enough, I guess. Her mental state is dragged between the exaggerated positivity of her life in the limelight and the pain of her past trauma with the trials of becoming an actress in the first place. The story itself is interesting, however, the act of using the stage in order to advance her story and the lengthy animations transitioning from scene to scene are too drawn out for their own good. It's a blight on a decent level. The board game-inspired Waterloo world is my second favorite level in the game. The level itself is super creative with how Raz moves from talking to the players to shrinking down to the size of the figures, moving them with telepathy, to walking amongst the characters to impact the game board itself. Also, the transition between each of these individual parts is completely seamless. I'm just blown away with how it's all presented. The actual board game itself is pretty linear, but the execution is top-notch stuff. Moving on from my second favorite stage to my actual favorite stage is Black Velvetopia. The colors of the main game are traded out for the colors found in a Black Velvet art piece, with the harsh blacks contrasted by rich colors. This area alone has a gorgeous style that honestly stands the test of time. The actual level itself is a fun set of platforming challenges on the streets to avoid the running stage hazard, and fighting off several mini-bosses against masked wrestlers to progress. All of this is tied together with a great story that has a fantastic boss fight to go with it. In my opinion, this level, along with the Milkman Conspiracy, are both worth picking up the game for. There's also a platforming challenge before you make it to the end. It's mediocre, but at least it's a change of pace from all the earlier stuff. I'm a little underwhelmed, but at least the level is not janky or anything like that. Wait, is that a segue? This is an old game, so naturally, I ran into some jank. I already mentioned how the characters look a bit weird, but something that I didn't mention was the subtitles. The most important part of the game. Out of preference, I usually play with them on, but this is one of those rare cases where I had to turn them off. The text size is just too big, and the font choice they used in the cutscenes just exaggerate the problem. Also, the character PNGs are unnecessary and take up even more space. This is really weird because all the in-game text looks fine, it's just the text in cutscenes that ruins the image. The cutscenes are extremely compressed, but the ratio of in-game cutscenes to pre-rendered is not really too much, so it's hardly a deal breaker. Though what feels like a deal breaker is the audio balancing with a specific NPC. This one teleports Raz to different portions of the level, and it makes a specific noise when you're near it, but you'll be hearing it no matter what, and it'll be obnoxiously loud even during cutscenes, which is very distracting.
Even a child can see I've lost control of this production. Okay, Becky, get a grip.
Child?
Also, I ran into one good old-fashioned glitch with the Milkman Conspiracy, where this door over here was spazzing out. Is this where I can find the fabled 3% milk?
Come with us. What is the mission of the milkman?
I guess not. Keep in mind, this is an old game running on a modern computer, so the fact that I was able to get through the whole thing without too much problem is kind of a miracle. The one thing that I found to be more obnoxious is the bizarre need to grind for money to get the cobweb duster. I assumed this item was optional, but in the second half of the game, it becomes mandatory to get anywhere. So I had to grind like crazy in the overworld to get it. The other optional parts of Raz's moveset, like the extra powers, were more naturally integrated into the game's progression, so it's weird that the vacuum isn't handed to you after a story threshold or something like that. Speaking about the story, is it even worth a glance? Yeah, it is. Going past the premise, the story itself has a nice escalation of events, starting off on a calm day at Psychic Summer Camp to discover a conspiracy theory that poses a threat to the entire world. You know, typical summer vacation for a psychic kid. Most of the events and character interactions aren't too far off from the story that would be found in a cartoon at the time, but I do like how Raz goes through a personal arc in the latter parts of the game, which coincide with his growth into becoming a potential Psychonaut. I mentioned the level and their themes, and what I liked about the story is that there is an escalation from the characters that are fairly sound of mind, and Oleander, then escalates to a series of characters that clearly need help with a far more unstable mental world. Though it's safe to say that a game this old is not going to have the best representation of people with mental health issues, Boyd over here might as well be the worst case in the game.
I am the milkman. My employer has commissioned me to deliver this milk to whitewash what went on here. I make sure no evidence is left of anything except for milk. I cannot rest until I have made my final delivery.
There is an underlying desire from Raz to help the people through their trauma, which is a bit of a positive spin that I like. The only thing that I don't like is the last-minute redemption of a character at the end, but for the time this game was released, I guess this was a pleasant change of pace from the good versus evil dynamic of platformers at the time. Overall, it's solid stuff, but there is a part of the game that lingers on as the one part that no one likes. A part so infamous that I'll be handing out a timestamp to skip, cause this is literally the last level in the game. When I decided to come back to this game, one thing I was wary about was the Meat Circus, the infamous final level that broke so many players and remains as a blight upon this classic. I cleared it pretty easily with only a few hiccups here and there. Apparently, the old Meat Circus on consoles was a nightmare to go through. The version I played was the Steam release, which wasn't that bad. It's not a good level by any means, but if you level up the Psyblast to a decent amount, the first third will be a challenging but simple escort quest. The grind rail segment can kiss my ass though. Tight jumps that are easy to fail, plus a figment that I swear you have to jump to your death in order to pick up, make this part of the level into an active chore to get through. The last third is harmless enough, with a tough platforming segment with the added pressure of water flooding the area. This is followed up with an average final boss that thankfully doesn't overstay its welcome. Comparing the quality of this stage to all the levels that precede it, the Meat Circus takes last place without a doubt, but I feel like parts of the internet that place this into the halls of infamy might have exaggerated a little bit, which is par for the course with online discourse. I just felt the need to set the record straight. As a classic 3D platformer from decades past, I can say that this held up well enough. The game is also pretty cheap. It's $10 on every platform that it's available on, and for the amount of game that you're getting here, it's worth the price of admission, especially if you're a fan of 3D platformers. In August of last year, Psychonauts 2 had released, and it was an interesting sight to see. As of writing the script, I haven't looked too much into this game because I want to go into it relatively blind. Maybe if this review does well enough, there could be a video discussing the sequel? Maybe? Like, comment, subscribe, and all that junk. I'll catch you guys next time.